Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of On The Verge with your hosts, Kenneth Shinazuka and Ali-Reza. Today, we're going to be talking about spiritual capitalism. Should spiritual teachers be in the business of making money off of the courses they offer? I thought there would be two potential avenues for thinking about this. The first is psychedelics. So, obviously psychedelics are incredible spiritual vehicles for accessing universal truths. And in the past, these used to be, highly ritualized substances that individual small communities would use to, further their path in spirituality. But now, big pharma is potentially going to be taking over psychedelics in order to make it more accessible to people who are suffering from things like PTSD and treatment-resistant depression. Obviously a good cause, but, are we at the risk of, companies charging thousands and thousands of dollars for people to be able to access these medications? Additionally, you have the rise of, essentially ayahuasca tourism, where, billionaires or very wealthy people in places like Silicon Valley are spending upwards of thousands of dollars in order to be able to go to South America, take ayahuasca, but then arguably come back and just perpetuate the same behaviors that they did in the past, actually no wiser. That's one avenue. Second avenue is just thinking about spiritual teachers in general. So, once you become famous enough as a spiritual teacher, you can actually make a lot of money. One great example of this is Echart Tolle, who is a spiritual teacher who became famous in the late 90s after he wrote this book called The Power of Now. Before then, he was leading a very modest lifestyle. At one point in his life was homeless and, sitting on a park bench. But then after he wrote his book, he made lots of money, appeared on Oprah, and now charges upwards of thousands of dollars for people to attend his retreats. So what are the ethics of all this? Should any of this be happening? Ali, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Kenneth, for providing a good introduction. I think psychedelics is actually a great example. But let's focus on Echart Tolle, because I do know of Echart Tolle. It's interesting to think about the definition of spiritual capitalism. Well, capitalism is a system that promotes the savings of money for your own interest, for your own self-interest. So you make money through your spiritual courses, your books, and then you use that money to, let's say, buy a house or buy a car or have a lavish lifestyle. The point is that it is for self-interest. It is for you, for your own, not for others. I think it's really interesting to think about Echart Tolle, because there could be many scenarios what Echart Tolle could do with that money. So let's say he has an amazing mission, and his mission is use all the money he's charging to further enhance his courses, further make his courses accessible to everybody who's listening to him, and thereby expand consciousness. And so by investing in his podcast and his books and content, he can actually use that money to promote the good that he likes, the way he likes to promote the good, which is through his courses. I still have a question that even if Echart Tolle does that, then my question is he still using some money, some big money, let's say a couple of million, to, let's say, buy a house or buy some expensive, let's say, watch or clothing? Doesn't matter what it is. The point is that if he's spending some big money on a lavish lifestyle, is that ethical? I do think it's ethical if he spends the money on improving his courses. But then how much of the money is going to his own life and how much is it going to others? I think that's the main question I would have.
Right. So it's interesting that you mentioned this, because arguably, for any kind of company or individual that is charging a certain price, for a service that they're providing, they can use the profits that they earn to improve their service. So, take, for example, like a biotech company, right? Perhaps uses the profits that it makes in order to be able to create new kinds of technologies or do new kinds of research into, for instance, like, how to tackle cancer. So they use the profits they make to further achieve their goals. And as a result, they're able to cure cancer better, for example, or treat cancer better, and then make the world a better place. What distinguishes, I think, spirituality from a lot of these other kinds of industries is that spiritual teachers already claim to have figured out the answer. In other words, they know what the universal truth is. In the case of Echart Tolle, it's, being here now, being in the present moment. And so in a certain sense, there's nothing to refine. There isn't necessarily, a truth that you would be able to access if you were to have more money to be able to pursue it. It is true that, you could design, things that improve, I guess, like the public's awareness of those universal truths. But the universal truth is already there, and these spiritual teachers have already figured it out. So I think that's just an important thing to note. And then regarding your question about, should spiritual teachers be in the business of making a lot of money? I mean, I think it's a good question, and it boils down to whether or not you think that spirituality is a matter of asceticism. Eckhart's views on this are interesting in that, like, he thinks that asceticism is actually not the path to enlightenment. If you starve yourself and go into a cave and strip naked for 10 years, you're actually not necessarily going to be any closer to the truth than somebody who's living a comfortable material life. So Eckhart discourages people from doing that. But, and I don't think that he would necessarily be in favor of living a lavish lifestyle by any means either. And I frankly don't really know what Eckhart is actually doing with the money that he's making from all these courses and retreats that he's doing. But yeah, I mean, I think he would probably just say, like, make enough to have a comfortable life, and, just don't be excessive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think let's call this type of people who spend some money on their own life and spend some money for others. Let's call that responsible spiritual capitalism. I still have a big question for responsible spiritual capitalists. And that question is, let's say I want to go to Echart Tolle to benefit from his teaching and from his practice. Let's say he's teaching a practice of self-inquiry. Okay. I am a student. I don't have a huge income, and I'm looking for enlightenment, looking to improve my life. I go on his website and I see his courses, his events, and they cost, let's say, £2,000 for a two-day retreat. I think this is where I have a problem. It's not exactly what they do with the money, as long as they spend that money productively in whatever way they want, whatever way they wish. I think my problem is that, are there courses specifically for a certain kinds of people, rich people who have money and who have a lot of time, money and time to go to these retreats? I would like somebody like Echart Tolle or somebody like Rupert Spira to have let's say, pricing plans. And there is one option, which is lower income. And low income doesn't mean you spend $200-300. It means you spend something like £20-30. So you could kind of hit, you could achieve your goal of making money, of creating your courses, promoting them, and still make money, but still allow a certain kinds of people who don't have the money or the opportunity to come, for them to also be able to come to your events. It doesn't seem that there's something wrong with that, as in you could just forgo making extra money, but in case save those souls, let's say. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I've been to a couple meditation retreats in America. The longest one that I did was at this retreat center called Dharma Dena, or Dhamma Dena, in Southern California. And it was a very modest retreat. It was basically in like a few trailers in the middle of the desert. So their upkeep cost was pretty minimal. They were essentially just charging for, people to be able to stay there, people to have food, paying staff, and that was pretty much it. And so there was a sort of like baseline cost. And then on top of that, if you had a really great experience at the retreat, then you could also donate back to the center. And so, like there was like a minimal baseline, but then, if they wanted to improve their services, for example, then they would use the donations that they got from people who had a positive experience there. It seems to me to be a pretty good model. And then, I've also been to other retreats where there have been student discounts, But I mean, I completely agree with you that, it's very easy to, end up, I guess, A, charging a lot, but also B, sort of coming up with reasons to charge a lot of money. So like Depak Chopra, for example, is a good example of this. Like he has these extraordinarily opulent retreat centers in Southern California, where you can do things like, like have incredible massages and great, facials and just like, really nice, luxurious services inside of a really beautiful facility. And you'll probably come out of that feeling really relaxed. Maybe less so if you realize that your wallet is empty after the occasion, but, but yeah, it's also just not accessible, to, people who, especially people who are students. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that also, like, with a lot of this stuff, like a lot of the knowledge is freely available online. And, you might have to do a little bit of digging, but if you want to say, access a library of guided meditations, you don't have to pay for that. There's this app, Insight Timer, where you can get thousands of meditations for free. If you want to learn yoga, you don't have to pay for that either. Just do some searching on YouTube. And it's really, I think, like if you have the drive to search online, as long as you're okay with everything not necessarily being in one centralized place, then it is possible to get all this knowledge for free.
And that's exactly what they would reply. If you say that to them, they will say, well, we have contents freely available on YouTube and on my website and et cetera, et cetera. But still, I do think that the people who need the help the most are the ones who probably don't have as much money. So if you are organizing events and your goal is to improve people's lives, which people are you prioritizing? Are you prioritizing the people who have money and have time? And let's say they're working through some emotional issues, which I do not say I don't judge that. But there is a kind of, there is type of people who are genuinely struggling financially, emotionally, completely, and they don't have the money to even, and perhaps for those people, actually, if they hear the message, because they're in such a difficult place, the impact of, let's say, somebody like Echart Tolle's words could be a lot stronger, and they could be totally transformed in those events. Because I think even though, you have access to those videos, you don't have a mentor, you don't have a direct face-to-face communication, you don't have that direct teacher. A lot of the transmission of these teachings is actually personal. You learn this if you do spiritual courses online or if you do them in person, is that the true help that you get is not from reading or studying, it's from a transmission from a teacher to the student. So the actual learning is a transmission of the energy that goes between the student and teacher. And I feel like that's a lot more difficult to establish online when you're just watching the videos. So it's just one way direction. The energy is not two way, just one way. And I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I'm saying that probably not as effective as if you had a mentor or a coach like Echart Tolle or Rupert Spira. That's like a really interesting. Like a really interesting question is. Go on.
I was just going to say that I think that's a really interesting point. And I was going to bring up this anecdote by Ram Dass in his book, Be Here Now. So Ram Dass, for audience members who are not familiar, was a Harvard professor in the 60s who taught psychology and then got fired from Harvard for giving psychedelics to students. But he was one of the most renowned early researchers on psychedelics. And, he had extraordinary spiritual experiences with psychedelics, but always found that he would come down from the mountain afterwards. He'd have these peak experiences, but then they would end. And afterwards, he'd leave sort of feeling empty inside. And so he embarked on this spiritual path And essentially he was looking for someone to give him, a transmission, a transmission of some kind of a spiritual teaching. And he searched for many, many years, and then, traveled around the world and eventually ended up in India, where he met this guru, who then ended up becoming, his guru and spiritual guide for the rest of his life. And that guru was an extraordinarily powerful, energetic teacher, essentially, who Ram Dass claims had more or less supernatural powers that included things like telepathy. Like, for example, the first time that he met Ram Dass, this guru was able to know the cause of his mother's death a year prior, just first time face-to-face meeting, right? And then later on, he describes, for example, like, meditation sessions where everybody would be sitting down and the guru would just be there, simply sitting, but he would just be emanating these, this aura essentially of unconditional love.
That's the teaching.
Everybody in the room could feel that. Exactly. That's the teaching. And you can read that in words on a page. But it's an entirely different thing to have that transmitted to you energetically, which can only really happen in an in-person container.
Exactly.
So yeah, I can agree on that. Yeah.
Yes. Or even more accurately, not in person, but like a scenario where both of you are connected or talking to each other or in each other's presence. So they know you're here and you know they're there. Yeah. Because there are online transmissions. You can have a teacher receive a transmission online. It's very interesting because at the Oxford Psychedelic Society, which we both work in, we actually have a very good, I would say, way of organizing our finances. We charge only if there are certain special events that require us to give their speakers some money or the musicians some money. And perhaps a very like 20% or 15% off from the money we make that goes to the OPS, the Psychedelic Society, so that we can use that money to promote our events, whether it's marketing costs, whether it's creating better events. I think we're striking a good core, but the problem I have is watching people online and then thinking, okay, this is a spiritual teacher. And then I'll go on their website and I see the fees are £250 for an hour of consultation. See, the real interesting question, another interesting question is, I don't think the universe is like a calculus, as in all the money you earn, you have to spend it on other people, or you have to spend it on causes. I don't believe the universe is calculus. I believe the universe is actually a lot of the time telling us to have a comfortable life. Yeah, to buy that 1 million house that you want to, because that puts you in a certain state of mind and you probably get happier and more comfortable. And I don't see the universe as just like a dead calculus, as we all like a utilitarian way that all the money we have to earn. Like somebody like Peter Singer would say that all the money we earn, we have to, or at least not all of it, but the majority of it, we have to donate to others, support causes, charitable causes, and then have minimal amount of money to survive. But I think on a utilitarian model that makes sense, but on a more dynamic model of the universe where emotions themselves could be like a way of giving back, if that makes sense. Like the quality of your being could itself be a way of giving back to the universe. What Rupert Spira said in a podcast, that a meditator who goes in a cave and meditating, he has equal effect, if not more or if not less, than somebody who is just helping the poor. We can't see everything in a directly causal way of material causality, that if this person gets this food and survives, this is the only way people can be helped. I think if you have a different understanding of the universe, which includes something like all is mind and everything is a single mind, then your thoughts and emotions themselves could be a way of service. If you think positive thoughts, if you're having fun, all of those things, even though it's counterintuitive, they could be ways of service. So a more expansive understanding of the universe, which includes energy and includes state of being, I think that could allow us to look at people like Echart Tolle and, let's say, Rupert Spira, and perhaps not judge when they buy a house that costs 500K, but to see it through the lens of, well, there's many ways they can be helping people. And if they have a good house and they feel happy, they feel stable, that could be beneficial for them and for their community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're radiating good vibes, then you're making the universe a better place,
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's what it's about at the end of the day. And, I think that you need a certain amount of money to be comfortable. And I don't have any opposition to that. I think, spending money lavishly is probably not going to be good for radiating good vibes to the universe. But I personally have nothing wrong with, spiritual teachers living in very comfortable, nice places. I think they're not actively harming anybody by doing it. If they're able to, provide their services in an accessible way to people who are struggling,
exactly.
but then also, profit off of people who are rich, and then as a result, be able to afford a nice house in the process. I think that's totally fine. I have no opposition to that, really.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other areas you want to go into into the question of spiritual capitalism?
I think if you want, we can talk about the psychedelic stuff, which I think is interesting, because I think there are a couple of different ethical questions here.
Mm-hmm.
The first is what should the role of pharmaceutical companies be in making these medicines accessible? And the second question is how do we make sure that we honor the indigenous communities that a lot of these psychedelic substances originate from? So, for example, in Gabon, which is a country in Africa where a lot of ibogaine is native, a huge number of ibogaine trees have been trafficked recently for their ibogaine-containing roots, which is a huge problem. And in South America, again, you have this rise of ayahuasca tourism. It might be good to mention this anecdote about something that happened back in the 50s. So back in the 50s, there was this guy named Gordon Wasson, who was, I believe, the vice president of JP Morgan at the time. Very, very wealthy, very prominent dude, who heard about magic mushrooms and went down to Mexico, where he knew that it was being consumed in a ritualistic fashion, essentially got the trust of a local healer to give him the mushrooms. And then, he went back to the US, and mushrooms were on the front cover of Life magazine. This was back in the 50s. And magic mushrooms became popular in America. Gordon Wasson profited in some way or another off of this tremendously. What happened to the local healer whose trust he bought? Her house got burned down, and her, I believe, son or son-in-law was killed by the local community. This is a great example of where reciprocity has gone wrong in spiritual capitalism, meaning that people in the West, and we don't have to limit it to just the West. People everywhere have exploited indigenous communities for what they regard as incredibly important, culturally significant, spiritually significant modes of healing. Those have been exploited and have, potentially left communities robbed in the process. So how do we deal with that? Do you have any thoughts on that? Ali?
It's a very, very difficult scenario. I mean, right now you can imagine companies from America going to South America, and I don't know exactly how it works, whether they have to make deals with indigenous people or work with them. But I think even indigenous people, they're not necessarily angels and, from higher dimension beings. Well, if somebody gives them money, gives them something that they're happy about, I think they accept it. And I think this is what's happening now with the retreats in South America. There is a collaboration between the indigenous communities and, let's say, Western companies is really difficult, because I believe if the indigenous communities agree to the contract, then on that basis, they are inviting that to happen. There's a different scenario where somehow the Western companies could go to South America and use some other dodgy means, whether finding not really indigenous people, but just people who live in the area to provide kind of similar types of services, let's say ayahuasca ceremonies. I think, or just self-taught shamans or who are not part of tribes. I think that's where the issue is, because if cultural appropriation is anything, that would be cultural appropriation. But also, on the top of that, using their medicine for capitalistic reasons of making money. And those retreats, I mean, you can go online and see them. They're very, very expensive, extremely expensive. And I don't know how much of the money is actually going to the indigenous people, but because honestly, I have nothing wrong against capitalism. So it would be totally okay for the indigenous community to start a business. I mean, there's nothing wrong there's nothing wrong with a business, especially if your community is getting better and stronger. But I think we have to wait to see what happens, as in, are there going to be consequences with the natural environment in the Amazon? Are there going to be consequences in terms of river pollution? Are there going to be consequences in terms of environmental issues? I think if maybe there is a few bodies involved who can regulate this kind of transaction, this kind of contract between the indigenous people and Western companies, I think potentially it could be a good thing, because as long as it's regulated and the healers are certified in a way by the indigenous people, or if they're not indigenous themselves, at least if they have gone through the training, some rigorous training, I think it's okay, because ultimately we're trying to expand this healing, extend it to everybody who can benefit. And I am also against this idea that, ayahuasca shamanism can only be limited to South America. I don't believe anybody owns this stuff. Nobody owns the planet, and nobody owns the continent. So I think that's also a mistake to think, this is just for this community. And the only way it can be done is if you go to the tribal people, and nobody else can learn with some other training to come up with their own healing. I think that's also a mistake, because that goes into ego of ownership. You own this land, you own this practice, and you own this medicine. I don't think anybody owns this.
Right, exactly, 100%. And I mean, I think, I think we're in agreement here, because I also agree that there's nothing wrong with somebody who is an outsider to these indigenous communities learning about ayahuasca, the rituals for taking ayahuasca, and then coming back to, the West to be able to disseminate it. Because at the end of the day, more people benefit from that. If people don't have to travel all the way to Peru, to do an ayahuasca retreat where they can seek spiritual healing, and instead can do it in, their home country, then that makes it more accessible for everybody. I think that's totally fine.
Especially for the poor people.
Yeah, exactly. In Portugal, where all drugs are decriminalized, you can go on these ayahuasca retreats, where the shamans are people who are European by origin, but who have gone down to South America, who have spent substantial amounts of time learning from local tribes about ayahuasca rituals and ceremonies, and then have come back and have practiced these retreats for a number of years, doing it in a very culturally respectful way. I think that's totally fine. I think the issue is that like some people take ayahuasca or something like 5-MeO-DMT, which is produced naturally by a specific toad, take it once or twice, think they're enlightened, and then self-style themselves as a shaman, and start charging retreats, and take on this spiritual title essentially. That I think is definitely wrong. And so I do think that there's like quite a bit of care that has to be put into this. And I think that now we're seeing, I think in the West, the problem is that with the rise of these, pharmaceutical companies, I think the infusion of capitalism into psychedelics means that we are taking something that is very spiritually significant and turning it into something mundane. The best example of this, well, there are two examples of this. Number one is microdosing, which is essentially, some might say, a spiritual bastardization of psychedelics, because you're taking something that is meant to be consumed in a very ritualistic, thoughtful, spiritual manner, and instead you're taking it like a supplement so that you can be more productive and work more efficiently. I think that indigenous communities that heard about this would be quite upset about the practice of microdosing, because it's essentially yeah, go ahead.
I mean, that's interesting you said that, because then we will have the first point of disagreement, which will be interesting to dissect. See, I don't think there is one way to use, let's say, DMT. I don't think that way can be established by people who have been using it for thousands of years, because it's a kind of some fallacy of experience, that because you have thousands of years of experience and you've been using it in a particular way, therefore it must be used in a particular way for everybody, for everybody everywhere. I think that's a mistake, personally, because even though I think they're ritualistic, and the fact that they take high doses of DMT and ayahuasca, I do think that has its own place and purpose. But I have nothing wrong with somebody like you or me wants to improve their productivity and taking some DMT, or let's say we want to further go into our meditations or further enhance our mind. We take a very minute amounts of DMT. Or if somebody is depressed or anxious and they are just discontented with the medical establishment and they self-medicate on DMT. And I have friends who do that and who have been hugely benefited because they take DMT on a regular basis, they microdose on LSD, and their mental health is improved. But then, so I see the fruit of the action, Jesus said something in the New Testament that judge them by their fruit. If you take microdosing and it improves your mind, improves your life and the life of people around you, there's nothing wrong with that. And, this goes back to something like religious authority. Well, yes, Christians pray in a certain way that's instantiated in the Bible. And yes, that's the way to pray that is sort of established by them. But there's no reason somebody could come along and use the Christian Bible and say, look, I'm going to pray in this way. As long as it helps their life and they do responsibly, it's fine. So I don't think that the natives have a religious authority over this realm of things. And I think DMT belongs to everybody. We produce it inside our bodies, right? So let's say I do breath work and I produce endogenous DMT, and somebody could say to me, well, you're not really, did you use the word bastardized, that you're bastardizing the spiritual? Well, I'm doing breath work. I don't know about them. I'm just using my own breath, using my own endogenous DMT system. So I mean, that's interesting, because I think we agreed on everything. That's the first thing we can at least have a discussion about.
I think it's interesting, and I do want to clarify that I was mostly speaking from the perspective of indigenous communities where psychedelics are used in a ritualistic way. Do I personally have a problem with microdosing? I guess not. I'm a utilitarian at the end of the day, and if people are becoming more productive, then I don't think that's a problem. But if you have the frame of mind that these are very sacred substances, then of course you're going to take offense to people using them in a non-sacred way, which is why the
what does it mean, sacred? What does sacred mean?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I mean, I think in this case, like, sacredness is definitely some kind of a cultural construct, in the sense that if you are a community where, taking a certain psychedelic is something you do, for instance, only at a specific time of the month or a specific time of the year, at a specific time of the day. And there's all this process of preparation, both physically and mentally and otherwise, in order to get ready for it. And, there's music and all, all these other forms of ritual surrounding it. Then of course, you're going to see the psychedelic as something that only ought to be consumed in that context, right? Whereas if you view these things purely as just chemicals, that can be used for any purpose without any kind of ritualistic context, then of course you're not going to see them in a sacred light. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you that nobody has a monopoly over this stuff. And I think what's interesting about, psychedelics in the present day is that, there's a division between these ancient psychedelics like ayahuasca and psilocybin, which is in magic mushrooms, which have been around for, as long as humans have been around. But then there are all these new chemicals, LSD being the most famous one, but then, MDMA, 2CB, and so on and so forth. All these are new. And so there's no ritualistic context surrounding them, which means that there's sort of a blank canvas for people to do whatever they wish with these substances without having to be concerned about any kind of cultural baggage, such as this concept of sacredness. I think, though, and this is where we can reintroduce the idea of psychedelic medicine. I think personally where this goes too far is when people invent, and this is currently happening right now, novel non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. These novel substances that are meant to have the same therapeutic effects of psychedelics, but without the hallucinogenic experience. That, I think, even from my perspective, is a complete bastardization of the power of these substances.
Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah.
Because you're depriving them of their essence, really, I think. And without that, they're no longer psychedelics. And I think it comes down to an aversion towards, hallucinations, drug taking, psychoactive substances on the part of pharmaceutical companies. So I think that's definitely an area in which psychedelic capitalism will lead to some problematic outcomes.
Yes, let me pick up your mind on something you said. So you mentioned MDMA and ketamine and things like that. That there is no ritual right now available for people to experience these things for healing purposes. Well, I think that actually is an invitation for our culture to create sacred spaces and sacred activities, and to create our own rituals to experience the substances in the way that provides maximum benefit for everybody. So let's say with MDMA, you could have white coat shamans like psychotherapists and people who are really trained in human behavior and can stay in the room with compassion, hold the space, and create a space with good lights, good music, good sound. And they're already doing that, I think, at different universities. People like, what was his name? I forgot, but the guy who's researching at Imperial College. Yes, exactly. Robert Carter Harris. Yes, so somebody like him. Yes, exactly. I think he is creating sacred spaces from what I've seen with my eyes. And I don't know if they call it ritual, but I think if the setting is controlled, they have music, sounds, colors, intention, preparation. I think they may not use the word ritual to remain secular, which is fine, but there's still a ritual. So I think what's unique about our culture, something positive about our culture, is that we have a vast number of chemicals available, each of which can help with a particular kind of problem. MDMA for PTSD, let's say. So it's really a great opportunity to really go for it, to create amazing sacred spaces, amazing rituals so people can be benefited, right? If the ritual, for me, is enhanced intentionality, both mentally and in the environment. So you make the environment intentional by having the right setting. You make your mind very intentional. That means you determine the date when you're going to take it. You very clear about what you want from the experience, your purpose, your goal. And I think with modern technology and with modern knowledge, vast knowledge we have of all the ancient cultures, we can really, really create amazing spaces, which is actually, if you think about it, is what we've been trying to do at the OPS, using the knowledge we have and what's available to create intentional ritualistic ritualistic experiences for people. And so we are already doing that, right? We do it with breath work, we do it with meditation, we do it with things like that. But again, it's not really the substance you take, it's the environment you create. The environment you're creating, both internal and external.
No, 100%. I mean, I agree with you that, we have these forms of therapy that are essentially emerging as ways of integrating the psychedelic experience, both during the experience and afterwards, and new kinds of, therapies that have been developed, for example, at Imperial, so that they're more suited to, therapy with magic mushrooms. I think there's a very important thing to note here, though, which is that this is not a form of ritual. When you take magic mushrooms in a therapeutic context, you're taking it to treat treatment-resistant depression, which is a very different thing from contacting spirits and communing with the spiritual world. If you're taking this in a therapeutic context, then there's a problem which you're seeking to address. It's not as though you're trying to gain wisdom and knowledge about the universe as a whole. So, for example, if we take the Shipibo tradition, where ayahuasca has been consumed in ritualistic settings for a very, very long time, there's this whole spiritual backdrop in which the rituals are taking place, an entire worldview, as opposed to merely an individual problem to be solved. For instance, ayahuasca there is not actually the main character. It's actually playing a supporting role. So if you go to a Shipibo retreat, at least these are the ones that are available in Portugal, you'll essentially be in a period of isolation for several days, and then you'll be prescribed what are called these master plants, which are plants that contain different spirits. So, for example, the spirit of the jaguar, which might make you more perceptive, might make you better at problem solving, and so on and so forth. And there are all these different master plants that correspond to different spirits. And the function of the ayahuasca is to connect you to those master plants, which are working at an unconscious level. So you take these master plants once a day, during this period of isolation. And then at some point, you take the ayahuasca once. The ayahuasca serves as a bridge between your subconscious, where the master plants are operating, and your consciousness. That is a completely different way of viewing psychedelics than, these settings where psychedelics are being used in a therapeutic context. Because again, there's an entire culture or worldview, a set of ideas essentially behind that.
So my question for you is that, do you think that we can create a space in the West where people are invited to come, secular people, if we are promoting a kind of spirituality that involves spirits and ancestors and the spirits of jaguars and other animals and animal spirits and things like that, which I'm totally open to. But I think, is that something people would see as something they want to do, especially in our secular culture? Does that not pose any issues with keeping things neutral? And maybe for true healing and true transformation, maybe you have to have those kinds of practices of connection to spirit. And I'm totally open to that, but I don't know.
Absolutely. So I think it's harder in the West. So, for example, in Brazil, there are several different religions that revolve around the consumption of ayahuasca. So, for example, Santo Daime is a church that essentially integrates Catholicism with the taking of ayahuasca.
Amazing.
So it's taking a pre-existing religion and turning it into a backdrop for taking ayahuasca. The reason why things like Santo Daime have succeeded and become popular, though, in Brazil is that, ayahuasca has been around for thousands of years. It's an ancient practice. Whereas in the West, psychedelics are still very, very new. And when psychedelics have been attempted to be integrated with religions, they often tend to be perceived as cults. and sometimes with disastrous consequences. I think it's very hard to create new rituals around psychedelics in an explicitly religious context in a way that doesn't seem culty, or in a way that doesn't seem to the public to be culty, even if people are approaching it with great intentions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think there's this huge issue of what is the culture surrounding psychedelics. Like, for example, like back in the 60s when psychedelics first emerged into the mainstream culture, they were surrounded by this whole atmosphere of hippiness, which I guess to a lot of people today has now taken on a bad connotation due to Nixon and the war on drugs and everything. But back then it was about something broader. It was about the war on Vietnam, for example. It was about civil rights. It was about all these things. And so there's this broader sense of cultural significance. But obviously, psychedelics were also used in a responsible way, and the science was not as advanced as it is now, and the FDA wasn't trialing these things for serving as medicines. So the movement sort of failed. Now the science is right, and the FDA is running these clinical trials, and it's all very legitimate. But the broader sense of cultural significance is sort of dissipated. Psychedelics are not being used as tools for a broader cause in America or in the UK or anywhere else in the West. So we sort of have to find, in my opinion, I think something culturally significant for psychedelics to latch onto, and I think that's tough.
I'm just going to quickly comment on what you said. Well, we have a mental health crisis right now, and if psychedelics are helping us in our mental health problems, do you not see that as a broader cultural issue? I mean, it doesn't have to be political; it could just be a mental health crisis. It could be a spiritual crisis, literally a spiritual crisis of materialism, which has infected the societies and created issues, and some of which we call depression and anxiety and things like that. But do we even understand what those issues are, what depression is, what anxiety is? I think ultimately those are spiritual trials which you go through. And if psychedelics right now are addressing that, then don't you think that is the broader cultural issue that psychedelics are addressing? I don't know.
I think my concern is that when we go to, obviously I know I'm a scientist, I'm all in favor of going all the way into the science, but I think my concern is that when people, especially government agencies that are now funding psychedelic research, when these agencies and these pharmaceutical companies see psychedelics as, just another chemical that happens to bind to the brain in this way, which then triggers this, downstream cellular signaling pathway, right? And, if we figure out exactly the pathways that it affects in the brain, then we can design these new chemicals that work more effectively and have fewer side effects, blah, 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 blah. That completely subtracts the spiritual language out of the practice. I think it's very important to preserve that. In the psychedelic experience. And I think that's why integration is such a difficult problem to solve. How do we get people to integrate this in a way that seems spiritually significant to them?
Yes, I think it's interesting in a scenario where we live in a free world, and let's say we want to extend the benefits of psychedelics and especially shamanism to people in the West. I think ideally you would have the actual practices that are developed by the native people, and you will bring them to the West. And those are people who have been properly trained by native people. I think in the real world, you're going to have multiple organizations, many actors, good and bad, some trained by the natives, some self-taught. Yeah, you may have self-taught teachers that are good. You may have self-taught teachers and providers that are bad. But I think ideally what you want to have is an ecosystem, a free ecosystem where there's government funding, but there's also charity funding for psychedelics. And then for the ones like people who have been trained by the natives or the natives themselves, for them to create better organizations that provides better healing so that they can show to people, look, our services are creating spaces which is conducive to the betterment of your mental health, better than the scientists who are just taking the chemicals and letting you experience something mundane, or just taking the psychedelics aspect away and allowing the chemicals to affect you. I think ideally what you want to do, personally, I think it's not the best world scenario, because I don't believe that we can actually limit people and companies from starting their own way of doing this. I think we should allow them to do whatever they want to do, and then really support those organizations that are providing the best service. And truly, if they're providing the best service, they should be getting the most customers, because people want to get better. And if I'm somebody who wants to get better and I look online, look at the reviews, talk to people, and they say, go to this Native Indian American center for psychedelics and go there for your healing, then I will choose that over some other place. But still, if somebody doesn't want to contact the world of spirits, they don't want the whole metaphysical baggage that comes with those traditions, then they could go to the scientist. Well, again, if they get better, all the better. They don't have to contact spirits. They can just get better in the way that they perceive to be good. So I think I like libertarianism. So I'm a libertarian, and I think let people, even bad people, do this badly, but then have transparency and openness, so you see who's good and bad. Not some sort of monopoly. If you have monopoly of some certain actors who have a lot of money, billionaires, taking over this business, this is the worry. And then they create their own version of psychedelic therapy, then I think we have a problem. And that's very likely because billionaires will eventually take over an industry. So I think there should be organizations that help individuals that are providing truly authentic experiences for them to create good businesses and to compete against the ones who are being supported by billionaires. But how do you do that? I don't know. I have no idea how you're going to do that.
Yeah. And I think also one thing I want to emphasize is that there is no real dichotomy at the end of the day between the spiritual world and the scientific world. At some point, there is going to be some union between these two things.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, whether you're explaining everything in terms of atoms or waves or fields or one gigantic pool of consciousness, there is going to be some kind of event that's happening in scientific mechanism that is occurring in the brain or elsewhere that explains all these different spiritual effects. But the problem is we don't know what that is yet, and we're very, 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 very far away from an understanding of what that is at the moment. But someday, hopefully these two different ways of seeing psychedelics will become linked to each other. I think the reason why a lot of pharmaceutical companies, funding bodies are trying to secularize psychedelics and quote unquote take the magic out of magic mushrooms is out of this fear essentially that using the language of mysticism will prove unpalatable to people who are hard-nosed scientists or people who believe in achievable clinical outcomes. I understand their fears, but we have to embrace psychedelics for what they are, which is spiritual vehicles essentially. And we can't lose them.
Yeah, there is a great example where I think the scientists will struggle to keep spirit out of the room, and I think that's the DMT, the long DMT trials that are happening. DMT-X, is that right? DMT-X.
DMT extended.
Well, I've heard a few people talk about the DMT-X experience, it seems like, I don't want to go too far in what I'm going to claim, but it appears that the DMT experience is somewhat more uniform than the other psychedelic experiences. You meet and encounter a realm full of entities, intelligent entities that are autonomous, that are more intelligent than you, and you recognize that. And fascinating thing that happens with DMT that doesn't happen with other psychedelics is that you come from the experience, the majority, and they say, this is more real than real. This is actually, you never get this statement from anything. Maybe with occasional dreams that you have, you said that was really real, But even in dreams, people don't tend to say this was even more real than this reality. And, there could be a principle that the human body and the human system is also like a measuring device, if it works, if it functions properly. And if your measuring device is telling you that was more real than this, and then you get that across the board, millions of people, like 60, 70% of people take DMT, come and say, these are intelligent beings, and I'm not sober. I'm talking to you as a sober person, and I still believe that. So I think with that, we have a problem. And then the problem gets even bigger if people are in the DMT experience for longer periods, let's say 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and the world seems to be like a consistent, coherent world with beings you can interact with. Right, and I think it's fascinating. Like if the scientific studies of DMT takes it to the ultimate goal, ultimate end of what is possible to scientifically study, I think people are going to really, really struggle to just hand wave this as, well, it's just the chemicals in the brain, bro. You just high, bro. There's nothing else, I don't think you can dismiss, I don't think you can dismiss that, because there are certain principles where you can determine what reality is, and that's consensus, that's consistency, that's coherency. And those are the principles we use to determine this reality, right? If something is consistently appearing in front of you, you would say, okay, now that's there. And somebody else sees the same thing and says, I also consistently am seeing this object. Then that object becomes an object that is, in the public world. Now it's a real object. Well, something really similar is happening with people who are experiencing DMT, even in the initial studies with Dr. Rick Strassman, that there is a consistency, uniformity between people's experiences. And what do we do with that? Honestly, there can be so much research done on the philosophy of experience, how we determine an experience to be real, and compare that to the DMT world. And I think we're going to really struggle to just dismiss that as pure chemical reaction in the brain. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, so, I think there are two separate questions here. One is like the metaphysical question, and the second is like how this stuff like pertains to therapy. I think, I completely acknowledge and agree with people's assessments that, this is, at the end of the day, you have to trust the people who are taking the DMT. And if they all conclude that, or if the majority of them conclude that this feels more real than real, then then that's true by default, because they're reporting directly from their own experience. And that very well could come down to some kind of mechanism that's happening in the brain that, that something is happening, and as a result, your consciousness is changing, and you have this feeling that what you're perceiving is extremely real. And then I think there's like the question of how this comes back to ethics, because if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're prescribing DMT for, let's say, I don't know, it could be anything from depression to headaches. DMT is a very effective, well, the science on this is still very preliminary, but could be very useful for treating cluster headaches, which are a very painful form of headaches. If you prescribe this, right, and somebody gets, blown out of their body into this alternate universe where they see these extraordinarily lifelike beings who seem to be higher powers, and they come back, and all their therapist tells them is, well, as long as you're feeling better with respect to your headaches and your depression, then forget about the entities, it doesn't really matter. We don't take a stance on this. I don't think there's actually a way that you can avoid that, because therapists kind of needs to have answers. They can't just be like, oh well, we're agnostic. I think I think you have to actually kind of have some kind of explanatory framework in mind.
Yes, and I think that's why the therapists also. Yes, and I think that's why the therapists have to themselves be very experienced with these substances. At least 100 to 200 times, at least, I think. Yeah. So that you don't just dismiss this.
Yeah, this is a debate I've had with a few people about, should psychedelic therapists take the psychedelics? It's a good question, because I understand the argument against it. Like, for example, should people who treat bipolar have had past experience with bipolar? I think more people would say
that's a slightly different. Yes, I think that's slightly different though, because with bipolar, I think with bipolar, it's impossible to become bipolar, right? With DMT, there's an opportunity to take this and to experience this, right? With bipolar, I think like you can't, and you shouldn't. Like if you're a healer, you shouldn't become bipolar to treat bipolar, because then you're hurting yourself. But with DMT, there doesn't seem to be much of a, huge harm on your body. In fact, tends to be a benefit to you. So, can you, as a therapist, then talk to the person who's just taken some DMT and talk to him through his experience? If you yourself haven't had any experiences, I think that would be a weak psychotherapist, personally, because there is a danger of dismissing or trying to explain away this phenomenon, or just focus on the healing and not focus on a broader picture.
Absolutely, man. And I'm inclined to agree with you, of course, but I think this puts companies in a very precarious ethical position, because you're telling these therapists who are providing your service to illegally take a drug, basically, right?
Well, not illegally. They can do it legally. They can go to South America or Portugal. They can easily travel.
Yeah, that's true. You could go to South America. That's a fair point. And
yes.
That's a possibility. But
in the beginning, Albert Hoff. Sorry. In the beginning, Albert Hoffman and people who were the first group of people who were using LSD for healing purposes, the rule was try it first yourself before you give it to your patients.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good rule, because you get to appreciate it, you get to understand it, you're working with it. Even if you experience, you also get to, like the shamans in South America, work with the spirits, and maybe you can change your frame of reference, your viewpoint over what spirits even are, because spirits could just be intelligent aspects of nature which are communicating to you. There's nothing weird or mystical about it. It's just powers of nature, and then you're in direct communication with powers of nature. So I think if psychotherapists truly experience DMT, I think eventually they will come back to what the shamans have initially thought what these experiences are. And that doesn't mean to say you tell the patient, oh, this is a spirit of a jaguar interacting with you, or this is some alien. No, but it gives you an empathy towards an acceptance towards people's experiences, and allows you to be more open than dismissive.
Exactly. And in many cases when you take ayahuasca, for instance, in the Shipibo tradition, like the shaman will take the ayahuasca with you as well, which I think is kind of inconceivable to like modern scientists in the West. Like the idea of getting the therapist high on mushrooms while the patient is him or herself high on mushrooms, seems like probably a crazy idea to a lot of people. But I mean, I think that, like, in the same way that, like, I mean, going back to the example of bipolar, like, as somebody who has not had bipolar in my life, I can sympathize with people who have had bipolar, but I can't empathize with them. I don't know what it's like to be in their shoes.
Exactly. Yes.
And
it's a very good distinction.
I think anybody who's sufficiently emotionally intelligent can sympathize with somebody who's going through a psychedelic trip, but can't empathize with it.
Exactly.
They just don't know what it's like at the end of the day. A lot of ideas like interconnectedness and ego death are just words until you actually experience them.
Yes, exactly. No, that's a very, very interesting distinction, because empathy, in the way you define it, is we have to have an experience that is similar to the other person. Then you can truly understand what they're going through.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a point I was going to mention. Has to come back to me. It's not necessarily directly connected to ethics, but it's a thought that perhaps psychedelics are a very reliable tool to change the minds of scientists that are ordinarily focus on, very direct focus. They don't have a horizontal focus. They have a vertical focus, and tends to be the way the scientist minds work, right? Very focused on, very reductive, going into every atom and every detail, rather than a holistic approach. I think it would be interesting that psychedelics, because they directly give you that experience, let's say you're a scientist, I don't believe you can experience many of these substances, especially DMT, over time, and not have any change of belief or views about what reality is. I think it will be very difficult to imagine that, especially if I think what I see is that young scientists who tend to be open-minded, tend to be more cooperative with the spiritual people from other cultures. Because they're young, because they're open-minded, you guys can build a good foundation for the people to come after you. A foundation not necessarily based on any belief, but based on radical openness to what could be real. But then when you experience something, openness itself is not enough. Because you could say, I'm just open to experience, and you keep experiencing, let's say, intelligent entities, and you keep coming back, and you say, well, I don't want to believe anything, I'm just open. But then still you're denying those experiences, right? Like if you have an experience which involves, let's say, higher power, higher dimensions, and not saying that's necessarily true, but you could be in a place that's just more than open, like a place where you're learning, where you are working with the spirits. Not to say they're real, but to say working with these intelligent entities, if they are real. Because in the world there can be many organisms that are intelligent, that are perhaps accessible through DMT. So if you're a scientist and you know that you can access powers of nature directly, then you can use that to enhance somebody else's experience or enhance your knowledge. It would be a kind of resistance to not be open to that and just say, well, I just want to be neutral, because being neutral is not neutral. Because if that's your principle, I'm always going to be neutral. Well, that itself is a very strong principle that you're going by.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I had a supervisor in undergrad who mentored me in Alzheimer's research, and his name is Rudy Tanzi, and he used lucid dreaming to solve research problems, and claims that up to 90% of the insights that he arrived at in his dreams actually ended up being true in the quote unquote real world. And that's another example of essentially accessing an altered state of consciousness in order to derive insight about what's happening in this reality. And so, I agree with you that, scientists are going to use this and hopefully arrive at new insights. And even if you're not a scientist, like philosophers, for example, like I was having this conversation the other day with this guy named Roger Crisp, who is one of the main,
Roger Crisp.
Roger Crisp. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of my essays was based on Roger Crisp.
Really? Yeah. I met him because he's I think he's like an advisor for my lab, basically, the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing at Oxford.
That's amazing.
And as you'll know, he's one of the world's foremost hedonist philosophers. And I was talking to him about MDMA. And I was like, if we found a way to make MDMA non-neurotoxic, is this something that, people ought to be taking ethically? And he was like, well, the problem is that, if you just have this dose of euphoria, it's never going to be the same as, for example, like listening to like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which, for you will carry a lot of personal meaning. It's like, well, if you try MDMA, you'll realize that it's not just a dose of euphoria. A dose of euphoria is something that's intimately connected with feelings and meaning and so on in your life. And will lead you to have a transformative experience. And so, I think like taking these substances is also good for philosophers too, to expand their notions of what well-being is. So,
and as a philosopher, I think it's amazing to notice that if you haven't experienced something, you can't even begin to either dismiss or approve or understand. In fact, you have no internal reference for it,
Right?
Because our references are from experience, right? So you gather a data bank of references in your mind or in your brain, and they're based on the experiences you've had, and based on those you make value judgment that this experience is like this or this is better than this. If you've never had MDMA in a therapeutic session or in a spiritual session, you can't say, well, I enjoy Beethoven more, because more than what?
Right.
There's an idea they have, like a concept of what it is, but it's not actually a thing. So if he's a philosopher and he's honest, he can't even talk about that. As in, he cannot even open his mouth and talk about it. The only way to talk about it is to first experience it, build an internal reference, and then say, okay, Beethoven music is better than MDMA. Then, okay, good. You're a good philosopher.
Open your mouth,
but you
put the MDMA inside of it and then swallow it, and then you can talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
We do not endorse this as recreational purposes.
Well, if you have PTSD, well, I think we could tell people to have as an option the possibility of therapy in a therapeutic context. You could join a research team or join a university that's doing research on PTSD and MDMA, or go to Portugal, spend a couple of £1,000. People spend a couple of grand on many things. If you want to transform your life, and there is an opportunity that you feel like is good for you, well, assess that for yourself. But then you could go and experience something that could be transformative for you. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, we spoke about many things, but it's very interesting that when people like scientists or philosophers talk about psychedelics without taking it, there is a kind of I get annoyed at that, and I think the annoyance is not like just like a random emotion. It's a philosophical annoyance, because it doesn't make sense. Logically, it doesn't make sense to talk about something and comparing it without experiencing it. It just doesn't make sense.
Yes, exactly.
So we've reached 1 hour and 12 minutes. If you have any other points you want to raise, Kenneth?
No.
Or I'd like a way to conclude this, or maybe bring it together.
Yeah. You're right. We've talked about a lot of different things. I mean, we started off by talking about whether or not spiritual teachers should be in the business of making lots of money for themselves. And I think we came to the conclusion that as long as they make their services accessible to people, then it's perfectly okay for them to lead at least a comfortable life. And then we started talking about psychedelic medicine and how to make these commercial in a way that is fair to indigenous communities, and also in a way that preserves the cultural or spiritual importance of these substances. And then in the end, we started talking about psychedelics and new notions of meaning, and how to integrate that also in therapeutic contexts. So a lot of different topics.
Yeah, it's been very fruitful. Thank you so much for joining me again.